All right. So, one of the questions that you guys are going to see is towards the back, and it's a map, and it asks you to kind of explain the electoral results, and it involves you guys putting together demographics, geography, and party identification. There's quite a bit to juggle there. So we're going to, continue to go through demographics right now. Excuse me, and then bring in the geography part of it. And then tomorrow I'm going to sit you guys down with some maps and have you try to just look at the map and see if you can put all three together, okay? And we'll do that during our long block to break it up a little bit. Where we had been is we had just looked at the Jewish population and party identification, and now we're on Catholics. And I'm going to put a little disclaimer out there, I guess, as we go from Catholics to, we'll talk about African Americans, we'll talk about the elderly. It feels a little weird to kind of, talk about these groups, and this is how women vote, and this is how African Americans vote, and Hispanics. It feels like I shouldn't be categorizing people that way, to be honest with you. But it is one of the realities of politics that there are trends, and you just got to keep in mind that they are trends. And political analysts use that to their advantage to craft campaign strategy. So it's good to be aware of. So, as we continue to talk about groups and talk about what groups tend to do, that's kind of totally counterintuitive to typically what social studies teachers do, which is to tell you not to generalize and not to stereotype. But that feels like what I'm doing, right? So disclaimer, and we move on and we continue to do it anyways, and we'll talk about the Catholics now. The Jewish population, we had talked about voting historically with the Democratic Party. And some of it was because of the ideology of the religion matching up somewhat with the Democratic Party. And again, I also talked about how it seems kind of, I always wrestle with the idea of I thought they would identify more with the Republican Party based on the Republican Party's staunch support for the state of Israel. But that is not as central to the Jewish identity. The state of Israel is the remembrance of a history of persecution, the idea about helping out the disenfranchised. That lines them up with the Democratic Party. Similarly, you see that with the Catholics. That again, if you look at religious values, Christ's teachings, the idea of reaching out to the less fortunate, that aligns. Republicans might give you an argument that says that it's not the best way to help out the poor. One of the best ways or it's not necessarily the best way, to help out the poor through entitlement programs. But again, in general, we're doing a lot of that, those kind of ideas line up. So that's the initial kind of impression you get. On first blush, when you look at it, of course, the values line up. But what you have to remember, too, is the waves of immigration that came to the United States. The first wave of immigration was Protestant. You start with the Pilgrims on the Mayflower, and you kind of continue with those Protestant waves of immigration. Later, though, it's Catholic. And they're coming largely from impoverished, Catholic countries on the heels of, often there might have been some sort of revolution or instability. That if you, after Napoleon and as the European forces redraw the map and as nationalism wakes up, you've got a wave of revolutions that sweep through Europe prior to World War I. You also have the Industrial Revolution rolled through World War I, and a lot of people get displaced there, and that's that whole second wave of immigration, Ireland and the potato famine in addition being another kind of major factor. So if you look at, and think about your own background, you probably have a lot of people in your family or somewhere in the family tree that came from Italy, Germany, Ireland. That's all that second wave of immigration. Those are largely Catholic. And the Democratic Party did a lot to reach out to those groups. As we move away from the spoils system as a way to, garner political support, one of the things that you see is through the New Deal and through the Great Society, things that both reached out to those groups and then cemented that control. That having been said, the Catholic group is one that has done a bit of a pivot to the Republican Party. So you would say that, traditionally, the Catholics identify with the Democratic Party, but their support isn't as solid or as monolithic as it used to be. Okay? And some of that is because of the social issues. What's interesting, though, is, again, there's a bit of counterintuitiveness to this. When you look at the Democratic Party's position on abortion or same-sex marriages or even women's issues, it doesn't seem as consistent with the Catholic Church. But what you have to remember is, just like for the Jewish population, the state of Israel may not be their number one issue. You have to remember with Catholics, what the Catholic Church's position on these things isn't necessarily dogma for them. The church and the church elders might have a more conservative stance than their congregants. And so, yes, you do have on social issues a reason why Catholics might have pivoted to the Republican Party, but really, again, they're not as consistent with the church. They tend to disagree with the church on a lot of those issues. And really what explains it more is economics. Economics explains most things, to be honest with you. When you look at centuries of Catholic integration and upward mobility, as they climb into upper income brackets, it explains more why they would begin to identify with the Republican Party. So here again is where I'm cautioning you. As a social studies teacher, I keep saying never generalize and don't stereotype. And here I'm reminding you that, none of these voting blocks are monolithic. Remember monolithic, that kind of singular structure. There's some complexity to it. One of the ways to kind of see it is to look at the split within the Catholic Party when it was 2 election cycles ago when John McCain was running against Barack Obama. And white non-Hispanic Catholics broke for John McCain. The Latino Catholic vote went for Barack Obama. That was race, that was income, that was religion. And you could see that kind of race and income trumped religion. The Catholic bloc kind of broke along ethnic and economic lines. Okay? Protestants. So Protestants tend to vote Republican. If you go all the way back to the Protestant Reformation and you begin to think about Martin Luther, why wouldn't you? And his idea about salvation is possible through faith in divine grace alone. I don't need the church. I don't need external factors. I only need internal factors. That plays well with the Republican emphasis on individuality. When you think about the crazy Calvinists that came along as one of the religious groups where they believed in the elect and you had to demonstrate that you were part of the elect, and it was all about no drinking, no dancing, no playing cards, no showy dress, no profane language. You didn't do anything kind of sinful because sin was a waste. Idleness was a waste. If you had time to drink and dance, then you were doing something wrong. You should be thinking about Jesus. You should be working in the fields, right? So that idea about, the work ethic, that Protestant work ethic, that Calvinist work ethic, again, plays well with the Republican emphasis on individualism. The idea that everybody can kind of pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. The Protestant groups continue to kind of divide, and you got some of the evangelical groups, some of the groups that were a little more fundamentalists, believed more in the idea of like proselytizing and knocking on doors. They take a much more conservative position on a lot of social issues. That plays well with the Republicans. And again, as a reminder, as we did immigration, that first wave of immigration was Protestant. Again, they had the first kind of inside track on upward mobility. So Protestants tend to be, they tend to be a little more wealthy. I suppose I qualified that 15 ways as I said that. But there's a correlation between Protestantism and wealth, and that explains, again, people tend to vote the pocketbook, why they would associate with the Republican Party. All right? Gender. Women tend to vote more Democratic. Men tend to vote more Republican. Again, we can generalize, and really we are generalizing here, but the idea that I would stress that this is through societal factors, that, whether we intend to or not, there still is a tendency to socialize men and women slightly differently, to socialize women so that there is this more consensual nature, this more altruistic nature, and for boys to kind of socialize them a little different, to be perhaps emphasize the individualism, emphasize the when women make a decision, perhaps we emphasize, let's make a consensus and let's kind of come up with a decision together and what's best. For boys, we might do the opposite in terms of how we educate and socialize them. So you can see if that is the case, if that's how we socialize, it's not how we're born. There's having a boy and a girl. I can tell you that. Boys don't necessarily gravitate to the fire trucks and the girls to the dolls, and they kind of operate in separate spheres. There's a ton of overlap in terms of what they're interested in and how they play, and socialization plays a big role. But one way or another, you do see this kind of difference, and that may be an explanation that, when women look at entitlement programs and they look at health care and education and Social Security, they might be thinking more altruistically and therefore lining up with the Democratic Party, whereas men may be emphasizing the idea of, again, self-reliance. The Republican Party has kind of a line about a muscular approach to foreign policy and defense, and that lines up with the machismo kind of differences I'm talking about. That having been said, again, there's this big mistake I think people make about talking about the women's vote, and obviously a kind of a critical swing demographic. You can see with Hillary Clinton's campaign alone how I think people oversimplify, because for some they portray, if you don't support Hillary Clinton, that's kind of a betrayal of your gender. But for a lot of women, there's a number of issues that trump gender identity. There could be religion, income, ethnicity. All of these things might trump, the gender issue. And so I think politicians make a mistake when they think of women as simply a simple voting demographic, that if I just play up women's health care issues, of course I'll win the female vote. There's a number of things that obviously can override that. Okay? Ethnicity, race and ethnicity. Let's talk about white people. White people tend to vote Republican, and people of color tend to vote Democratic. I did this in the Civil Rights Unit. So what I hope you remember is that there is a correlation between race and income, and it, in many ways, can become cyclical and self-perpetuate, because once that correlation happens, it affects. If you are of a lower income group, there tends to be educational disadvantages, and that in turn will impact income. The higher the level of education, the higher income that you have. And so if your education is impacted and then your income is impacted, then you are less able to pass on opportunities to the next generation, and it becomes somewhat cyclical. So, remember that correlation, and it's really a correlation between race and income. People aren't making less necessarily because of race, but race historically has led to disadvantages, which then self-perpetuate and affect income. So at any rate, this explains in part why the people of color would identify with the Democratic Party from the New Deal, creating a lot of the entitlement programs, from the Great Society, creating a lot of the programs that tried to use government as an agent of change and to promote equity. If that is the case, though, it also explains why low-income whites would identify with the Democratic Party, right? So again, don't think of it as all whites are going to, go Republican, because they don't. Income, again, might be a central feature. Religion might be a central feature. Affluent African Americans might be more likely to go with the Republican Party. What's interesting is as I'm talking about people of color and income groups, if you want an example of like a notable exception, it's to look at the Cuban Americans. Typically, the Hispanic groups go Democratic, with the exception of Cuban Americans, who tend to go Republican. And that has to do more with the unique history of Cuba and the United States. So Castro being a kind of a central figure to all of this, and depending on the age of the person who is Cuban American, if they remember Castro vividly, and they remember some of the struggles that they had because of Castro, they're going to be more staunchly Republican, because they looked at the democratic handling of Cuban-American relations and Kennedy's kind of botched Bay of Pigs approach, and got soured on the Democratic Party. The Democratic policies that support the entitlement programs and some of the kind of the aid programs remind them of socialist Cuba. So, between the Democratic policies and the Democratic history with Cuba, they don't like them. Republicans tend to be more staunch on the idea of we've just started to normalize relations with Cuba. But up to this point, we've had a pretty absolute embargo with them. And the Republicans, supported perpetuating that. And the Cuban Americans, at least the older Cuban Americans, certainly approved of that. What's interesting is if you're a younger Cuban American, age might trump ethnicity because they don't have the remembrance of all of this, and it's not as centrally important with them. Okay? Nice and easy, right? All right, let's start bringing in geography now, just to kind of add another level. So what you've got swirling in your head is all of the kind of the demographic features. Now we want to start thinking about where these people live. We've got we've got a series of important primaries tomorrow, but what are two of the more important states? What's going tomorrow? Florida. One other. Ohio. They're important not only because of the size and the delegate count, but in the Republican race, those delegates go in what fashion? Anybody remember? If you win 51% of the vote. It's a winner-take-all. So these are going to be big kind of, delegate chunks. Don't you think it would be interesting to think about all these demographics and where they live? Who is living in Ohio? Who is living in Florida? And what issues are going to be important to them? And that kind of begins to inform your campaign strategy. So we've got to start bringing the demographics in with geography. And again, the question could be simply you're looking at a map and having to answer an open-ended question, or it might be more multiple choice. True or false, the Democratic Party or the southern states typically vote Democratic. Wouldn't be a true or false, but you get my idea. So just as kind of general rules of thumb, we talked about the previous solid South. The South used to historically be kind of locked up for the Democratic Party. And again, it explained, the pivot came when the Republican Party became the party that ended slavery. Lincoln's party, the party that ends slavery. By default, the Democrats become the party of the agrarian South. And that trend of the Democrats in the South, you're going to see it in the election map here in a second. They vote reliably Democratic all the way up to 1964 with the election of LBJ. This is where, because of civil rights issues, the South begins to pivot away from the Democratic Party. So, some of the trend may have started with the New Deal, but there's a lot of, poverty in the South, just like anywhere else. But really, it's with LBJ and the Great Society programs and the civil rights movement that the Democrats start to kind of break away. What also causes a break, perhaps, is the Republicans' maybe somewhat deliberate identification, too, of social issues. So if you have more, here comes religion, if you have more like Southern Baptists and religious conservatism and social conservatism in the South, that also plays well with the Republican Party. So there's kind of a dual factor that causes the switch away. And so, what you can see is, blue states, blue states, blue states. I've got it all kind of in one slide. We looked at, it's frame by frame the last time. But you can see, really here in 1920 and 1924 and 1928, 32, that's FDR. He does well. But you can see it's all blue, 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 right? And it's still that going in the 50s, into the 60s, and there's 64. And there's just this switch. That's the candidacy of Wallace. Here's the 70s. This is Carter, so that kind of throws things. But here we are back to red, back to red, back to red. There's just this complete switch over from blue to red, okay? So just know what the Solid South is, know why they initially voted Democratic, know why they switched to Republican. Other demographic trends. I told you that income is one of the biggest determinants of how people vote, because you tend to try to vote to maintain and increase your economic security. Washington, D.C., New Jersey, those are two of the richest states. Mississippi, West Virginia, two of the poorest. And there's a whole Forbes list. I don't know if there's any value. I'm going to, again, set you guys up tomorrow during the long block where I'll give you some sites to look at and you can do more of this to figure a lot of it out. So rather than watch me kind of click through here, they have a little slideshow of, the richest states. I don't know, is that exciting to watch me click on the next one and the next one? But you guys can figure out 1 through 10 on your own when I put that in your hands. I'll show you this little site, which I've shown you before, which shows you where there's the concentration of union workers. New York State being having the greatest concentration of union workers, followed by Alaska and Hawaii. What you see in part can be explained. There's the Rust Belt. You've got a lot of shipping from the Pacific and dock workers that explain the West Coast. Same thing kind of with Alaska. Here it's government workers that explain why such a high union membership. Okay, so knowing that, Ohio is going, and that's a former manufacturing center and considered part of the Rust Belt. Union might be kind of an important thing to think about as you campaign there, and what are their interests. In Florida, that's where old people go. So we got a concentration of elderly. Again, there's a link there that you guys can kind of scroll through and Arizona. That's all. You can find where all the old people are. That might be fun for you tomorrow to look to see where they're at and avoid spring break. I don't want to go there. That's old. So Florida has a high concentration of the elderly, and again, Social Security might be a key issue, but remember they tend to think that perhaps the Republicans can handle Social Security as easily as the Democrats. And for them, they're a little more conservative in terms of values. So, yes, you want to talk about Social Security, but you want to be careful about social issues to get that group. By the way, Florida is just a gold mine for who lives there. You got, Hispanic, Cuban American, the elderly. Every major demographic seems to be in Florida. Speaking of which, as we look for where the Jewish population lives. New York is the most Jewish state. Again, this feels weird. I shouldn't be saying these kind of things, but you want to know where people live. New York City is got the highest concentration of Jewish people, with 10%. Florida is number 7, but if I zoom in, here's Miami, Florida. That's the number 2 Jewish city. Where do they make up 9%? Oh, in Miami, Florida, they make up 9%. And again, this is really significant when you think about just them as a world or U.S. population. You know, in the U.S., they make up 0.06% of the population, and yet 9% in Miami, Florida. So again, campaigning in Florida is kind of crazy with all the different age demographics and ethnic demographics. It explains in part what issues again they are talking about, though. Catholics, they primarily live along the East Coast. Rhode Island is one of the most, I don't know, Family Guy helps you there. Peter Griffin, being they do all kinds of jokes about him and his Catholicism. That might help you remember. New Jersey, Massachusetts, Connecticut, those are Catholic states. And again, you can kind of scroll through some others if that's of interest to you. Protestant states, we go more south. Again, I had mentioned I think I mentioned the Bible Belt. I mentioned the Rust Belt. You should kind of know where that is. You should know where the Bible Belt is. And if you don't, you can kind of, search for those tomorrow. So in the Bible Belt, we've got about 70% of the population being Protestant, and two of the most Protestant states are Mississippi and Alabama. Again, we talked about the issues that appeal to the Protestants. And again, income, there's a correlation between the Protestant faith and income because, again, they've been here longer and had more upward mobility. But as I go to southern states, you also have to look at, there's a trend there in terms of income. Okay, Hispanic population, one of the most places that there's the greatest concentration is New Mexico. They make up almost half the state's population, with California and Texas being number 2, around 38%. Again, here I am back in Florida, in particular in Miami-Dade, where the Cuban population makes up about half the population. But I've also got Colombian, Honduran, Peruvian. They don't vote the same. All right? Black Americans. There has been, what was interesting is, there was a big northern migration that happened. It happened from the Civil War on. There was jobs in the industrialized North. There was arguably more, racial tolerance. There was de facto versus de jure kind of segregation and discrimination, but arguably there was more opportunities in the North. What you're seeing actually now is a kind of a move back to the South, and a lot of it is because of a cheaper kind of amount of living expenses in the South. It's a little less expensive to live in the South. So more than half of Black Americans live in the South. They, however, have large kind of concentrations in New York, in District of Columbia. So you can kind of see that there's about, when we talk about District of Columbia, again, there's about a half of the population. And then Mississippi, 38%. And again, feels weird, feels wrong, but we can kind of, look at these links tomorrow and explore where everybody lives. And then again, you can be that campaign expert. Detroit, another. If you look at cities, that's kind of interesting. If you look at cities, Detroit has the highest population of African Americans at 84%. Jackson, Mississippi. Here we are in Florida again. Birmingham. Again, what you guys are going to have to do. This is a kind of a cool site that you'll get to play around. What am I ranking there? Age. That's where the old folks are. That's what I want. See, I'm not the only one doing it. Here's the New York Times kind of tracking where everybody lives by concentration. So what you can kind of do with this is look at a demographic. So that's population density. All right. So if I want to look at where African Americans are highly concentrated and how they vote, I start playing around with this to kind of figure out what my concentration of population is. you can kind of get it within a range and begin to see, okay, here on the map, I can see where African Americans live, whites, Catholics, Southern Baptists, people according to level of education, level of poverty. And then from there, you kind of think about what political party they identify with why, and then you have your formula for how to campaign, right? Make you feel good about the political process to know it's really a kind of a statistical algorithm? It is. Okay? So I know that's a lot to hold on to. So again, one of the things that we're going to have you do tomorrow is just practice some of it, to try to kind of take a map and start kind of thinking about who lives where, how they vote, and why, right? And we'll break up the long block with that. But now that we have that kind of, like I said, statistical algorithm, that idea about how people vote, we'll talk about the actual voting process at this point. And there are other factors besides your demographics that determine how you vote. Hopefully, some of the factors that determine how you vote are external, that you actually look at kind of candidates, you look at the issue, you look at other factors and cues, and you make up your mind that way. So to kind of round it out, other factors that determine how you vote, candidate appeal. That's often for many people a primary factor. We have a kind of there's a number of candidates out there, and you just have a gut level read on somebody. I like this person, I really don't like that person. It's based on, everything from just having a vague association with the name, knowing some, generalities about who they are and what they have a reputation for. We go on appearance. We have a tendency to like height. We have a tendency to, if the person's voice is too nasal, if they're, if there's any kind of off-putting, features to them. We like symmetry in the face. Appearance plays a big role, as does the personality, the personal qualities of the individual. So just to kind of, cycle through some exemplars, my favorite is Dwight Eisenhower. His campaign slogan, you guys remember, we went over that before. What was it? 3 words on a little pin. Explains why people vote for him. I like Ike. Done, right? He's a war hero. People like him. In he goes. People don't like Nixon. They liked Kennedy. It's funny. How many of you have seen the Nixon-Kennedy debate? Some sort of grainy black and white footage. You've seen that in class before? No? We're going to have to watch that then. I'll pull that up at some point. How many of you know that is supposedly what killed, in 64, that's what killed, or 60, that's what killed Nixon's run against Kennedy, that he came off as kind of sweaty and kind of beady-eyed and nervous. And when you look at it, when I look at it, I don't see it as much, but for people back then, they really found Kennedy as this confident, articulate. He wasn't sweaty. He wasn't beady-eyed. So, we look for that kind of likability and appeal, and it usually works for a candidate or against. Teddy Roosevelt, FDR being great examples, too, of those bold, confident, articulate leaders. Hopefully at some point, beyond demographics and beyond just the gut level appeal, you do get into the issues. It's kind of depressing that I've done all this talk about how people vote, and I am just now getting to, hey, how does someone stand on a particular issue? There is, I think, a misconception that issue voting does not occur. It does. It's just really hard to detect, and it's really hard to do, because for you to issue vote means a lot of planets and stars have to align. So, because if you think about it, how many issues are important to you? To what degree are they important to you? And what are the odds that the degree and variations that you have line up with a particular candidate? That's what I'm talking about, planets and stars needing to be aligned. How many of you did that I side with, just out of curiosity? You know what I mean then by the variations, right? There was like, if you open it up, there was like 12 different positions you could take on something, and then you could change the degree, and then it told you were a communist, but you were also a libertarian. So the results it spit out I didn't like, but the way it showed you the variations I did. So you're going to see eventually, as odd as it seems, when we finally get two candidates to run against each other, a Democrat and a Republican, they're going to have more debates. There's more debates coming. And what you'll find is, as you're listening to them, are they saying the same thing? They're going to come to the center, and they're going to talk about immigration reform. Maybe that's a bad example to pick. They're going to talk about foreign policy and how to handle Syria, and the differences won't be that extreme, or it just may not be clear to you what the heck they're saying. So again, I've got to get your variations and the candidates' variations to line up. That involves them taking kind of clear and distinct positions on the issue, and that doesn't always happen. So some of the things that we're going to have to kind of think about if that is going to happen is, one, you need to be this is all assuming that you're informed on an issue. So let's start with that. That's a pretty big assumption. I've been kind of talking about your variations and the candidates' variations need to line up. That's assuming you've taken the effort to understand. I have variations. I've actually kind of looked through the issues and come up with a position, and I can detect that there's a difference, and the differences are consistent with my own. My list of 1 through 10 is their list of 1 through 10, and they feel about it the same degree I do. And all other factors are secondary. My age, my demographics, my income, the issues kind of trump things. So it seems like, how the heck can you ever have issue voting? Well, one of the things I want to stress is that party identification and voting according to party line is issue voting. Because again, they've simplified everything for you, right? And we like simple. If you don't put that in an essay somewhere, whatever essay question I give you in campaigns and elections, even if it seems like it's not related, put it in there anyways, okay? The number one rule of campaigning and voting is to simplify this complex process. And parties simplify it for it. They are, they represent a way to boil down how I kind of feel about all these various issues, and I use them as a cue to how to vote, and that on some level is issue voting. All right? Another major section that we'll obviously not have time to go through, and I have to put some independent responsibility on you, is understanding the role that campaigns play. And again, it's a great year to be teaching. Every year it's great to teach elections, but when there's an election cycle going on at the same time, it's so much better because you can see all the things that I'm talking about. Not most, but half the people go into elections often with their minds not made up. It explains why we need a science of campaigns. So we'll pick up with that tomorrow. As we say goodbye to Peter.